In this final study of the history of the church in the early Middle Ages, I'd like for us to look at what I think is a very, very interesting aspect of that history, and that is the Celtic Church. Now, if any of you have Scottish ancestors, Irish ancestors, Welsh ancestors, then very likely, at some point, your ancestors were members of the Celtic Church, going back far enough. I think that's quite likely. Understand, this church is different from the Roman Catholic Church. It had its own existence. As a matter of fact, it was older than the Roman Church and was organized along somewhat different lines. It was a very viable, very important church in Britain, in the British Isles, for many, many years. Eventually, as we're going to see tonight, it was absorbed by the Roman Church. But I think it didn't lose its identity, and I think it made important contributions that have appeared later in the Reformation. I think continue to appear, particularly in the spiritual lives of those who are the descendants of the Celtic people. Our story begins back, as far as the Celtic lands are concerned, with the very early beginnings of Christianity, and we don't know that much about it. It's very shadowy at that point. There is no clear documentation as to where Christianity came from. We think that soldiers, Roman soldiers who were Christians, were stationed in Britain. Remember that Britain was a Roman province. It became a Roman province in AD 43. It remained a Roman province until AD 407, so almost 400 years it was a Roman province. That meant the presence of Roman soldiers, Roman forts in Britain for a long period of time. You can still see many Roman ruins in Britain today. So these soldiers came here to Britain before, in fact, we believe, long before there was a pope in Rome. So therefore, this Christianity had its existence apart from the papacy and really knew nothing of the papal developments. There was, we do know, a Roman officer named Maximus who proclaimed himself as emperor in Wales, and he's the earliest person we know anything about who was in that area and was a Christian. Now, what we can understand of the characteristics of this church is that it developed some features that were distinct and different from the Roman Church. For instance, they were very interested in the classics. They were very interested in education. They were very interested in keeping the learning of ancient Rome and ancient Greece alive. Now that seems strange considering the remoteness of Ireland and Scotland and those places. But it was that very remoteness that made it possible. Because you see, what happened in most of Europe, in Western Europe, is the invasion of the Germanic people. When they came in, they destroyed much of the Roman culture, and there were other subsequent invasions that will destroy much of the Roman culture in Western Europe. However, this area was so remote, so isolated, that those invasions did not reach it. Consequently, they maintained a tie with the Roman Empire, which had already absorbed much of the Greek learning, and consequently they could keep the lamp of learning glowing in this very remote place. I before mentioned to you about how medieval historians really become unglued if you use the term Dark Ages and apply it to the Middle Ages. That is not correct. At no point in the medieval period do we see the lamp of learning going out to the point that intellectual life is completely dark. There is a period in history when that happened, but it was long, long before, way back in the period of time between approximately 1000, 1100 BC and 750 BC. At that point, at least in the Greek world, the lamp of learning went out. And we have a dark period. We don't know anything about what happened. Not only the lamp of learning, but we have a total absence of knowledge. That is not the case at any point in the Middle Ages. And the area which more than any other area will sustain learning will be these Celtic regions. Now, the other area that's very important is not in the Christian world, but in the Islamic world, and that's Spain, because Spain was conquered by the Muslims in 711, and Spain had absorbed much of the learning of the ancient world, the classical learning, and that came into Spain, particularly in the great city of Cordoba in Spain. So those centers in Cordoba and then up north in Scotland and Wales and Ireland and in what is now England until the Anglo-Saxons came in was an area where we have classical learning maintained. Another thing that's going to happen is that the monastery that will develop in the Celtic lands has much more function attached to it than in the areas where the Roman Church prevailed. In other words, in the Roman Church, we've already seen the monastery was the most important institution, no question about that. But in one sense, the monastery in Celtic lands almost replaced the local church. It almost became the local church. It almost takes over the functions of the local church. It becomes so extremely important. Now, there never is a centralized church government that develops. It's almost like each monastery is independent. So there's no central church authority within this denomination, if you want to call it denomination. It's independently organized. I would like to say congregationally organized, but it's more like monastically or monasterily organized. The monasteries in Wales were known as, and I don't know much Gaelic. Matter of fact, I don't know any Gaelic. So if anyone knows Gaelic and would like to correct my pronunciation, feel free to go ahead. But spelling it L-L-A-N-S, Lians, that was the Welsh name for monasteries. It is regarded that Ninian was the first missionary to Wales. And by the time we get to the 6th century, we have what is known in the Celtic Church as the Age of the Saints. These were the leaders of the monastic movements. Those who were prominent leaders in monasteries, such as abbots of monasteries, heads of monasteries, and bishops, were known as the saints, and not canonized as they are in the Roman Church, but just great church leaders, so the Age of the Saints. So it was, in other words, the 6th century, that is the 500s, was a glorious century for the Celtic Church. The most famous monasteries that became centers of evangelism and centers of education were Iona, Schleich, Mnechiel, Inishmurray, North Rona, Sulasqueir, Bardsey Island, and Lindisfarne. Of all that list that I've read, Iona and Lindisfarne are by far the most famous. Lindisfarne is particularly noted for its beautiful illuminated manuscripts, which you can see on exhibit in the British Museum today in London. These manuscripts are usually copies of the Bible or of the Psalms, songbook, Psalter, and usually the first page and the first letter is extremely large, the letter is large, and is then illuminated with all kinds of beautiful graphics of drawings, and just spectacular. And you look at this artwork, I don't think anyone who would look at it would say this is an example of the Dark Ages. This was beautiful art, very creative, very lovely, done to the glory of God. But Lindisfarne was a center of all kinds of learning. They had these libraries, wonderful libraries, where they kept the books of the ancient world, the books of the Greeks and the Romans, along with the Bible, along with the Fathers and the Christian works as well. Each monastery was organized by an abbot at the head with the aid of presbyters. Presbyters, of course, we call elders. That's the word for elders. So the abbot was the head, and then the elders working with him. The bishop in a Celtic monastery was the missionary and the teacher. In one sense, subordinate to the abbot. And so a bishop, very different from the Roman development of the concept of bishop, was the person who preaches the gospel, who goes out as a missionary and works with the abbot. There was a great emphasis in the Celtic Church on the purity of the heart. It was really a heartfelt religion, so to speak, interpretation of Christianity, that we must from the heart serve God and love God. Now, there's an interesting reason for that. They tended to emphasize, maybe more than we might say they should have, but they believed all the Bible, but they tended particularly to emphasize the works of the Apostle John. Of course, is known as the Apostle of Love, and has much to say about the heart and the matter of love. So they claimed that, what they claimed was that their particular liturgy, their worship, their style of worship, came directly from the Apostle John. That was a tradition with it. And so there was this interest, because of that, in the writings of John. And that may have something to do with this emphasis on purity of heart, emphasis upon love. Now, as far as their basic theology is concerned, they were very orthodox, little o orthodox. They were much in line with what the church councils later defined, but they weren't a part of that process of working out the theology in the church councils that we've looked at before. But they wound up being very, very true to the basic doctrines of the Christian faith. Now I want us to look about the history of this church, the history of it up to its end. It will end in 664 when it merged with the Roman Church. And that was at a famous synod called the Synod of Whitby. So our study doesn't cover much time in terms of years, but some very important things happen. First of all, during the great, wonderful, glorious years of the Celtic Church in the 6th century, and even earlier in the 5th century, we begin to see invaders coming into the island of Britain. These invaders were Germanic. Germanic people were spreading out all over what had been the Roman Empire in the West. They were taking over different parts of it. Some Germans took over Italy, the Ostrogoths. Some Germans took over Spain, the Visigoths, until the Muslims displaced them in 711. Some Germans took over North Africa. They were the Vandals. Some Germans took over Gaul. They were the Franks. Some took over that Alsace-Lorraine region. They were the Burgundians. And some began to move into Britain. Actually, there were three kinds of German people: Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Angles, speaking a Low German, coming from the area up to the north part of the continent of Europe, in the Frisian areas. The Saxons, speaking High German, from Saxony, and the Jutes, somewhat in between, largely more of a Low German than a High German. Now, these groups came in. They couldn't even understand each other. The Germans couldn't. Angles could not understand Saxons. Saxons couldn't understand Angles. They came in. They established 7 independent kingdoms. They couldn't even unite. That was called the Heptarchy. The Saxons established 3 kingdoms. The Angles established 3 kingdoms. And the Jutes established 1 kingdom. They took over the southeast part of the island, that part that today is known as England. England means the land of the Angles, Angle land, hence England. The Angles actually occupied only 3 out of the 7 little kingdoms: Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. The Saxons had West Saxony, South Saxony, East Saxony, otherwise known as Wessex, Sussex, Essex. And the Jutes had Kent. Moreover, these Germans were pagans. They were not Christians. Now, of course, if you were the Celtic people, you'd been ruled by the Romans, now the Romans were gone, and here come these Germans, they were not very pleased to see them come. They came first scouting, their men came scouting out the land, and then they went back and got their families, brought their families, and settled there, and it was obvious they were going to stay. They drove the Celtic people out. They drove them northward into Scotland, they drove them westward into Wales, and they drove them all the way across the sea into Ireland. And all the Celtic people, of course there were Celtic people in these other areas already, earlier, but the Celtic people in what is now England were driven out to join their Celtic brothers in these other areas. So, with that kind of very bad relationship between the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts, there was no communication for a long time. And consequently, the Celts did not make any direct effort for a long time to convert these pagans to Christianity. And these pagans were not interested in contacting the Celts to be converted to Christianity. So for a while there was no contact. There was isolation. The Anglo-Saxons completely destroyed all the Celtic institutions in England. Nothing was left. No vestiges of the Celtic civilization there. And of course, you can understand the bitterness that the Celtic people had. This went on for quite a while, until the end of the 6th century, when the King of Kent, Ethelbert, was converted to Christianity. His wife was a lady named Bertha. Her father was the King of Paris. France was already Christian, had been for 100 years, so Bertha was a Christian. Bertha the Christian married Ethelbert the pagan. And there were subsequent intermarriages between their families that I mentioned last week, but this was the first contact. And in 597, as we have seen earlier, Pope Gregory the Great, who discovered some Angle slave boys, thought they were very beautiful boys, asked who they were. They're Angles. He says they look like angels. Are they Christians? No, they're not. They're pagans. Well, we must take care of that. And he sent Augustine, a missionary, to the land of the Angles to convert them. Now, all this is happening about the same time. Ethelbert becoming a Christian, Augustine with 40 monks coming to England to convert. But of course, it's Pope Gregory sending Augustine, and Ethelbert was converted to Roman Christianity. So what we see is Roman Christianity beginning in Kent with its capital city of Canterbury. Hence the Archbishop of Canterbury to this day being the chief English prelate. Ethelbert was most impressed by the lives of these Christians. It was the way they lived, it was the example they set that perhaps was more impressive than even the doctrine. Now, once these Romans came in, they became aware of the Celtic Church. And actually what had happened about the same time is that there was a gradual trickling down of Christianity from the north. Eventually, it's going to happen. People living close to each other. Now, this is in Northumbria, where the capital of Northumbria is York. We have a little city in America called New York. So Old York is over there. And the Archbishop of York is the second highest prelate in England. And so, since the border that's shared between Scotland and Northumbria is a long border, eventually contact. And some of these people in Northumbria were being converted to Celtic Christianity. And so Celtic Christianity began to trickle down from the north at the same time that Roman Christianity is coming up from the south. So when Augustine came in, aware of Celtic Christianity, he met with some of the representatives of the Celtic Church. And they sat down and said, what are our differences? Well, we have differences in the date of Easter. Now that was a very important thing to these people, the day they observe Easter. That could be a very critical thing. We might tend to say that's not too important, but to them it was. There were some differences in the form of baptism. Of course, some differences in the organization of the churches. And when the Celts met with these Romans, and Augustine opened the idea of perhaps you can just join with us, the Celts said no. Our tradition is older than yours. We believe it's more accurate than yours. And consequently, we don't want to lose our identity as Celtic people, so no thanks. We will not consider merging with the Roman Church. And because of this refusal, and because of the differences, the Romans then branded the Celtic people as heretics. But you can't work with people without coming to know them, love them, understand them. It's going to draw you together when you start cooperating. So they started cooperating, and pretty soon the differences between them became more and more minimal. And as they grew closer and closer together, more and more people are asking, why do we have two churches on this island? Two different churches. Now, Roman Christianity was making great headway. It was spreading northward at a fast rate. And so finally, Roman Christianity is going to get all the way up to Northumberland, which is that northernmost part of the Anglo-Saxon territory, and of course into East Anglia as well. And in East Anglia there were Celtic people, and they wanted to build a cathedral in East Anglia. And the Roman Christians and the Celtic Christians said, why don't we build one beautiful cathedral? Why do we have to build two of them? So they worked together and they built a beautiful cathedral in East Anglia. Now the capital of Celtic Christianity was Iona, which is on an island off the coast of Scotland. And from 563 to 716, that was a real center of Celtic Christianity until the Vikings invaded. Lindisfarne, the great monastery of Lindisfarne, was established by Aidan, who in fact was from Iona. So the influence spread from Iona to Lindisfarne, and Lindisfarne became known as the Holy Island. And then it was followed by Yarrow and Wearmouth. Now what am I saying? I'm saying that Celtic Christianity was expanding rapidly, was establishing more and more monasteries at the same time that Roman Christianity was expanding. And so what is happening is that Celtic Christianity now, after many years of having no contact with these pagans, is beginning to make great inroads into England, establishing monasteries, converting many, many people to Celtic Christianity, and here comes the Roman Christianity as well. The Celtic bishop Cedd worked in Mercia and became chaplain to the Saxon king of Essex. At Lindisfarne, the great Aidan was succeeded by Finan, and Finan was very pro-Celtic, very anti-Roman. Then there's a gentleman named Wilfrid from Lindisfarne, educated at Lindisfarne, so well-educated, Celtic, but he traveled to Rome, he met people in Rome, and he, because of the contact with the church in Rome, thought, why are we divided? These churches should unite. We shouldn't have two separate churches, we should have one church. So Oswy, at the same time, who is the king of Northumberland and a Celtic Christian, married a Roman Christian. So we have Wilfrid, Celtic person from Lindisfarne, traveling to Rome. We have Oswy, Celtic king of Northumberland, marrying a Roman Christian. Meanwhile, Finan, who is the abbot at Lindisfarne, is watching all these events with great concern. He is afraid that if union takes place, the Celtic Church will lose its identity, and the true traditions, which they believe are true, will be lost. But in spite of that, missionaries continue to work side by side, and missionaries have to cooperate. If you're going to convert these pagans, you can't be at war with each other. You've got to present a united front to the pagans if you're going to convert them, and so Celtic missionaries, Roman missionaries, working side by side. And so everything's set up. I think you see everything is set up now for union. It's going to come. It's moving in that direction. Another aspect of cooperation, Oswy, the king of Northumberland, which is probably one of the most important areas of the seven kingdoms, with its capital at York, cooperated with the king of Kent in selecting the Archbishop of Canterbury. In other words, the Celtic king and the Roman king, two kings here, one of them Celtic, one of them Roman, will cooperate in establishing the chief clergyman of the English Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Another ingredient as we move toward Whitby, Oswy had a son named Egfrith, and Egfrith and Wilfrid, wonderful Angle names, right? They were good friends, and they did traveling together. And so the two brought pressure on Oswy, Egfrith's father, the king of Northumberland, to call a meeting. Basically, Egfrith and Wilfrid went to the king of Northumberland and said, it's time to sit down, get these two churches together. You're Celtic, I'm Celtic, but we're cooperating with Roman Catholics. We need to pull these churches together. So they pressured him for a meeting. He called the meeting at the double monastery of Streoneshalch, which is later called Whitby. This is a monastery that was, at this point, second only to Lindisfarne in importance. It was built originally in 658, lasted intact until 1763. The tower collapsed in 1830, was badly damaged, but it was restored in 1920. At this meeting in 664, the decision was that the Celtic Church should join the Roman Church. Now the question is, why was this decision made? Oswy made it. He's the king of Northumberland, so he became the spokesman for the Celtic Church. Not everybody agreed with that. Not all the abbots and bishops in the Celtic Church agreed, but there was no question that Oswy was the most powerful spokesman for the Celtic Church. Let me suggest three possible reasons for that. One, he needed help from continental Europe, which was Catholic. If he did not join with the Roman Church, he would be isolating himself from the rest of Europe, and that was not politically a wise move to do. Secondly, he probably sensed the trend that the Roman Church and its influence was spreading. And thirdly, perhaps because he got so many family members who are Romans, and this division within the family was bothering them. The union was helped along when Finan died. He was the big obstacle to uniting the churches. And Colman came to the position of abbot at Lindisfarne, and Colman was not in favor, but not so adamantly opposed. Now, what happened at the Synod of Whitby is interesting, because it was a debate. It was an interesting debate. where both sides presented their arguments. Just kind of sum it up for you. King Oswy of Northumberland opened the session with a plea for unity and a search for the true traditions. In other words, we should be one, we should not be divided, but we should unite on the truth, what the true traditions are, what the true forms are. We should find that, and we should all accept it. That made sense. Coleman then spoke on behalf of the Celtic Church. He made the argument, our traditions are apostolic. They come from John, the Apostle John directly. Wilfrid spoke, and Wilfrid was a great speaker. Remember, he's Celtic, but he's representing the Roman Church. He said the Roman date of Easter is observed nearly everywhere. We're the ones out of sync in the date of Easter. Then Coleman spoke. Coleman said, but our tradition is from the elders in the church, all the way back. It's the oldest tradition. It's older. It's the practice of the early church, and therefore it's right. Wilfrid spoke. He said, I compare that to Judaism when it disappeared from the church. In the early church, yes, the early church continued to hold on to the Jewish forms, but gradually those Jewish forms disappeared. Keeping the Sabbath and circumcision and the feasts and all of that, they gradually disappeared. And he said, that's the parallel, if you want a parallel. And Wilfrid went on to say, Peter observed the true form of Easter. Interesting how he knew that. And he says, then the followers of John soon changed to the true date of Easter. And then here's the question that really cinched it. Wilfrid then turned to Oswy the king and asked the king, does Columba, remember that Columba was the missionary who brought Christianity to Scotland, does Columba have more authority than Peter? Does the missionary Columba have more authority than the Apostle Peter? And then he said, let me tell you, speaking to Oswy the king, what I mean by that. Jesus said in Matthew 16:18, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. If the Lord said that to Peter, then Peter had the authority. The church is founded upon Peter. Peter's the bishop of Rome. And that means that every subsequent bishop of Rome has the authority of Peter. Now, Columba doesn't have more authority than that. That's called the Petrine thesis. That's the argument that has been advanced from the very beginning to justify the papacy. And first of all, it was well presented by Wilfrid. He was an excellent debater, an excellent polemicist. And it was convincing, not only to many, many others through the years, but it was very convincing to Oswy. And Oswy said, that's it, that's all I need to hear. We will join the Roman Church. As a follow-up, Theodore of Tarsus and his associate Benedict Biscop came to England and into the Celtic lands in 669, sent by the Pope, to bring about unity, to work gradually, to go into different churches, to different monasteries, and work to unity, to replace the Celtic forms with the Roman forms. They did it by bishop, abbot by abbot. Slowly, but peacefully, there was this changeover, this transition from the Celtic form to the Roman form. In 669, for instance, Mercia was fully Romanized. By 719, Iona was, and the South Picts. In 768, all of Wales. Interesting that the Welsh Church did become independent again in 1920. And so there was a peaceful fusion of the Celtic and Roman forms, with the Roman form being the accepted form. Did that totally end the Celtic Church? I don't think it did. I think that there was among the Celtic people, Celtic Christian people, a great love of adventure, a great zeal for learning, a spirit of independence, sometimes asceticism, denying the world attitude of emphasis on the heart and the purity of the heart and simplicity that I think remained. And I think that it flowed into the Reformation, and I think it has affected religion in this country. So the story of the Celtic Church is a story really that needs to be told.